Hey. It's late. You're probably alone right now, just like me. Welcome to Things I Can't Explain. I'm not going to tell you who I am, and you won't know what to make of me either. Some nights, the silence gets loud, and that's when the real questions start. Tonight, we're talking about the moments that don't add up, the things that happen when the lights go out and the world feels just a little too thin. These aren't just stories, they're warnings I never meant to share. So, if you're ready to listen, let's get into the first one. This happened to me last November, right around 2:15 a.m. I was walking home through the subway station near the river, the kind of place that always feels a little too quiet, even when you know the trains are coming. The overhead lights were flickering in a rhythm that didn't match the hum of the ventilation, casting long, stretched shadows across the wet tiles. I'd taken the shortcut through the empty transfer tunnel because I'd missed the last train, and I was just desperate to get to my car in the parking garage. I'd walked this path 1,000 times. It was a routine, a safety net of familiarity. I knew exactly where the flickering light was, where the grate rattled in the wind, and where the exit to the street was. That night, I remember thinking it was a bit cold, though I had my coat zipped up. The air smelled slightly different, not of the usual damp concrete and stale coffee, but like something faintly metallic, like old pennies or maybe just ozone. I saw a figure ahead of me, standing by the ticket turnstiles, facing the wall. I assumed it was a homeless person sleeping it off or someone waiting for a train that wasn't arriving. I slowed my pace, keeping my eyes on the ground, just wanting to pass him without making eye contact. I was convinced I was safe. I was the one in control of my own path. But as I got closer, the figure didn't move when I passed. Not even a twitch. It was unnaturally still. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on my eyes, or that the person had been frozen in place. I quickened my step, my heart starting to hammer a little too fast against my ribs. Then, I heard the sound. A soft, wet dragging noise, like a heavy coat being pulled across the floor, but coming from right behind where the figure had been. I stopped and looked back. The spot by the turnstiles was empty. Just the cold, tiled floor. I turned back around, telling myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired. But then I heard it again, right in my ear, distinct and clear, a soft, rhythmic breathing, perfectly in sync with my own, but out of phase. I spun around, but the tunnel was empty. I started running then, my breath coming in short gasps, my feet slapping against the slick floor, but the breathing followed me the entire way, getting closer with every step, never loud, just perfectly there. I burst through the exit doors and didn't stop until I was in my car, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely make the lock turn. I locked the doors, leaned my forehead against the cold steering wheel, and waited for my heart to slow down. I was sure I was fine, just had a moment of pure adrenaline. But when I finally looked up, the rearview mirror was fogged over, not from the cold outside, but from a warm, damp breath being exhaled from the back seat. I screamed, threw the car into reverse, and drove straight into the garage wall, the metal screeching, the air inside the car suddenly smelling intensely of that same metallic copper scent. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the car with the engine running, lights on, watching the garage cameras, waiting for a patrol to come check on me. They said I hit the wall, that I had a concussion, and that I should go to the hospital. I went, got checked out, and they told me I was fine physically. But I never went back to that subway station. And every time I park my car in that same lot now, I notice the rearview mirror is slightly fogged, no matter what the temperature outside is, and I can still smell that copper tang in the air, lingering where there's no source to explain it. I know I locked the doors, but I never could figure out how the glass was fogged from the inside. I've never told anyone this. It happened in my childhood home, the one I moved back into after my parents passed, 3 years ago. I was living there alone, in the 2-story brick house that had stood on the edge of town since the 70s. The nights were always quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the house settling in the walls, the pipes groaning as the water cooled. I'd been living there for a few months, and it felt like a sanctuary, a place to finally rest. But then, around 2 in the morning, the silence started to change. I remember the first week was just normal. I had my own routine, reading or watching TV until I fell asleep in the master bedroom on the second floor. The house felt familiar, even comfortable. But there was one thing that always bothered me. Every time I went downstairs to get a glass of water at night, I'd find the back door latch had shifted. Not open, just pushed down a fraction of an inch. I'd assume I must have done it myself in a daze, or maybe the wind had caught it. It seemed like a plausible mistake, the kind of silly detail your brain files away and forgets by morning. The house was old, the wood warped, and things like that happened all the time. I told myself it was nothing, just an old house being an old house. I even taped a piece of paper over the latch just to see if it would move on its own, but the paper stayed put. I figured that was the end of it. But then, the noises started. At first, it was just a drag along the hardwood floor in the hallway, a slow, heavy scrape that sounded like a socked foot or maybe a dropped broom. I'd wake up, sit in the dark, and wait. Eventually, the dragging would stop, and I'd fall back asleep. A week later, I woke up to the sound of my own front door handle rattling. It was the deadbolt side, the one that had been locked from the inside. The metal clicked and turned slowly, then stopped, followed by a long, held breath on the other side of the wood. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed, but by the time I reached the top of the stairs, everything was silent. The next night, I found a single, muddy footprint on the kitchen floor, right in the center of the linoleum. It was a size 10, fresh and distinct. I called the police, but they said there was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, just a muddy shoe print. They suggested I check the locks again, and maybe move to a hotel. I didn't want to leave, so I stayed, but I stopped sleeping with the lights off. The climax happened on a Tuesday, when the power had been out for an hour. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, the only light coming from a single candle, when I heard the sound of the front door opening. Not the lock clicking, but the latch lifting and the door creaking inward. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking across the floorboards. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were walking right toward me. I saw a shadow stretch across the floor, elongating as it moved closer, but there was no person standing there. The shadow stopped directly in front of the couch, and I felt a cold breath against my ankle. It wasn't the wind. It was warm, but smelled like wet earth and something metallic, like old copper. The shadow lifted, and I saw a hand, pale and long-fingered, reaching out from the darkness, brushing against my knee. I scrambled backward, knocking the candle over, and the fire sparked on the rug. When I finally found the strength to look up, the shadow was gone, and the door was closed again, the latch locked tight from the outside. I didn't stay the night. I packed a bag in the dark, grabbed my keys, and drove to a 24-hour diner 40 miles away. I didn't go back until the next afternoon, under the bright sun. I checked every lock, changed the deadbolts, and called a locksmith to rekey the entire house. I spent the next week sleeping on the couch with a gun, just in case. But it didn't matter. I moved out the next month. I haven't gone back since, and I don't plan to. The weird part is that a month ago, I received a package in the mail. It was just a single muddy footprint on a piece of paper, with no return address. The paper was fresh, but the mud was the same exact shade as the one from that night in the kitchen. I still have it, taped to the inside of my closet door. I don't know who sent it, or how they knew where I was living now. I just know that sometimes, when the lights go out, I can smell that wet earth and copper smell, right here in my apartment, and I know I'm not alone. This happened to me about 3 years ago. I was stuck in a motel off a 2-lane road outside of Elysium, Nevada. It was the dead of winter, snow piling up against the windows, and the place was a single-story slab of beige stucco with peeling paint and a parking lot that felt like it belonged in the middle of nowhere. I had pulled over because my car had stalled, and the manager was the only one awake. I didn't expect anything other than a night of sleep, but the silence that night was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like the air itself was pressing against my eardrums. I had checked into room 14 for about $12 a night. It was clean enough, with a floral bedspread and a tiny heater that rattled when it kicked on. The first night, I noticed the door latch was loose. Not broken, just loose. I pushed it once, and it swung inward an extra inch before catching again. I assumed it was just bad construction, the kind of thing you expect in a place this isolated. I pushed it back into place and told myself it was fine. The next evening, I left a bottle of water on the dresser, and when I came back from grabbing a soda, the cap was twisted slightly counterclockwise, even though I was certain I had closed it tight. I chalked it up to a draft from the old window frame or maybe a nervous habit of my own. I was tired, the roads were treacherous, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. I decided to leave the next morning, hoping the drive would clear my head. By the third night, the feeling of being watched had turned into a physical weight. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the heater click, when I heard a sound from the hallway. It wasn't a knock or a footstep. It was the sound of something dragging its fingernails along the wood paneling on the other side of the door. It was slow, methodical, like someone testing the surface. I waited, heart hammering, but nothing happened. The next night, I woke up to the smell of wet earth and rot, a scent that didn't belong in a dry motel room. The door was wide open, the chain lock dangling uselessly on the floor. I grabbed my keys and rushed out to the lobby, only to find the manager asleep at the front desk, snoring. When I asked about the door, he looked up, confused, and said, "I locked it myself before closing up." "You must have forgotten to check the chain." I went back to my room, locked the deadbolt, and sat in the dark until sunrise. That last night was the worst. The air in the room dropped so sharply my breath hung in front of me like smoke. The temperature gauge on the wall had cracked, the glass face shattered inward, yet the heater was blasting hot air against my skin. I heard the dragging sound again, closer this time, right outside the window. I looked out, but there was nothing but snow. Then, the glass pane of the window, which I had double-locked, suddenly went foggy from the inside out, as if someone exhaling warm air against it. The glass cracked with a sound like a gunshot, a spiderweb of fracture spreading across the surface. I backed away, but the crack moved toward me, not spreading, but contracting, pulling the shards into a single, perfect circle. The door behind me clicked open, and the smell of wet rot filled the room, thick and suffocating, before vanishing as quickly as it arrived. I left the motel the next morning at dawn. I never told the police about the door or the window. I just got my car running and drove until the road opened up onto a highway. I haven't been back to Elysium, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone on a dark, empty road, I'll catch a glance of a motel window in my rearview mirror. It looks exactly like the one I was in, the same peeling paint, the same chain lock dangling on the floor. The only difference is that the glass is clear, and I can see someone standing inside, watching me with eyes that are too wide, too white, and entirely too still. That's all I have for tonight. I hope you're safe where you are. I'm curious if anything like this has ever happened to you, or if you've had something unexplainable that still keeps you up. Please, drop your story in the comments below, I read every single one. Before you go, check out the next video. It has some stories that are even harder to explain, and I'm not sure how I'll sleep after watching them again. If you want to stay with me through the dark, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Good night.